Welcome to day 6. Yesterday we added some more flight information in our backend, and now today it's time to use that Swagger and Open API information that we have created yesterday and bring that into our Angular project so that we really get the flight information in Angular from ASP, because that's exactly how things are working. Angular is our front end and it gets the data from our REST API backend. So we will install an npm package which is called ng open API generation, which automatically creates the client-side code which is exactly matching our REST API. Packages we install in .NET are also added to the project file, the file with the C# project extension. And packages we install using npm are added to packages.json under the dependencies section. Packages.json file also has a dev dependencies section which includes the packages that are only required during development. For example, build and test tools. For sure, the dev dependencies should not be deployed to production environment. To build an Angular application for production, you can simply run angular build and then configuration equals to production in the root folder of the client app. npm installs all packages as production dependencies by default. So to install a development dependency, you can call npm install -d and then the package name from the client app folder. So just let me get that clear again. If you install something, a package, which you only need for development, you can install it using the -d flag, which is development package flag. Yesterday, we added the Swashbuckle library to our web API project. The library is capable of generating documentation for API as we have seen. So Swashbuckle library can also reveal the JSON version of the application's REST interface as Swagger JSON file, right? We took a look at that yesterday. The ng open igen library on the other side, which is an npm package we can use for Angular, takes the Swagger JSON file as input, right? So our backend is providing the Swagger JSON of our REST API, and then Angular will download it and use it, right? So it accordingly generates the Angular client API, and the client API is that part that connects to our backend API to ASP. And now you might be wondering, why do we use it like this, right? Do we use a package that automatically generates code for us? Well, in real world scenarios, it is essential to have such a workflow to confirm to have a single source of truth. Otherwise, you have to keep the API between clients and server consistent manually, which is painful and error prone, because every time you change the backend API, you will also have to change the front end API, because if you don't keep them both on the correct version, you will break and you would need to test and fix it manually. So this is why we just simply write down the code in ASP.NET backend API and then use a nice tool which creates some sort of documentation for us about our API. And then we use Angular with that open API generation, right? So that this Swagger file, this documentation of our API in backend gets consumed and Angular automatically builds up a client API, which is exactly matching our backend API. Now let's jump right into it and get that done today, because this is a very exciting part since we are connecting our front end and our backend both together. Welcome to this video. In the last presentation, so in the previous video, I explained to you that we will set up an API in the front end too, which will connect to our backend API, right? So Angular will connect to ASP. Now, if you have ever worked in web development, you probably know that there's something called CORS, Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. Now, what we need is to say, at least for our development server, that any other resource, let's call it origin. So what CORS is doing is to allow which domains are allowed to connect to this domain right here or to our application. So just imagine you have our Angular application on a different domain, port or whatever, and you have the ASP project also on a different domain. So if you do not set up CORS, by default, your Angular project will not be able to connect to our ASP.NET project because ASP is blocking it because it's not on the same domain, right? So this is just a security mechanism. So for development, we will go ahead and say app.useCORS. Then we call the builder, goes to builder.withOrigins. Now, origins are other domains in this context here. What we want to say is all origins. so we use the asterisk. Now, this means that any other domain, any other origin is able to make a connection to our ASP.NET Core application. Alright, now that said, we are ready to switch over to our Angular side of Vue, right? So just mentally shift now from ASP to Angular. Let me just close that program here. And then we will now start installing the REST client generator for Angular. First of all, let me get the goal for today clear. Here on the right side, when we now open up Client App again, Source, App, and then Search Flights, and then Search Flights component.ts. You can see this search result, right? I guess you remember it. Now, this is some hard-coded information, and it's nearly the same we got in our REST API backend in ASP. So now we need to remove that. That search result right here was just for development in the early stages of Angular. So we will now remove it, and instead of this information hard-coded in Angular, we will use our information that we have created in our RESTful API in ASP instead. Alright, let's install the ng-open-API gen package, which can automatically generate client-side code depending on our Swagger information or API documentation. Now, let me close that folder here and right-click on the client app folder and then open in terminal. Now let's install the package using npm install -d, right? You remember that for development, we only need that package for development. ng-open-api-gen. So npm install -d flag ng-open-api-gen. Now let's hit enter. After installation, we now create a file called ng-open-i-gen-json to configure everything, or everything that has to do with that Open API generation. Now, in the client folder, right click and add a new item. On the top right side, search for JSON and simply pick JSON file right here. Now, let's call it ng-open-api-gen. So the name of the package, right? Let's click add. As you have learned, JSON files consist of key value pairs. So let's configure 4 in general. So let's add 4 key value pairs in total. The first one is input. So what information do we need, or on which information should we build the client API? And simply go ahead, write down http:// and simply write down your URL, http, localhost, then your port, we will add that just in a second, and then /swagger/v1/swagger.json. So this was the URL. Now we need to get that port number here, right? Now, in order for the tool to make it easier to download the file, we don't use HTTPS right now, we use HTTP. So go into the properties folder in your main project and open up the launch settings. Now here you can see that we have 2 URLs defined, application URL HTTPS with the port 7280, and right behind there you can see HTTP running on 5280. So whatever you have there, copy it and simply paste it right here after the colon so that you have that URL complete, right? Now let's save it. Next key value pair is comma separated for sure. So go ahead and add a comma and then the output. So where should our generated code should be available? Source/app/API. Next one is skip JSON suffix. We set that to true. And the final one is remove stale files. Also set it to true. Keep in mind that you assign values in JSON using a colon and not an equal sign. Alright, so what is skip JSON suffix doing? It avoids adding messy suffixes to the service methods, and remove stale files is for deleting and replacing the files each time we run. And remove stale files is for sure deleting or replacing files that are, well, from an older version, no longer used, etc. Okay, so now we have that configuration set up. Now let's run the project. Click on Run. Copy your path in the input key value pair here. Copy that one. Switch to our project view or our live project or application and simply paste the URL. Now hit enter. You can see that we have our application here available. So Now we know that our path here is working, so you should also see your Swagger JSON file. Great. Now in the next video, we will really use that new install package ng-openeye gen to generate the client-side code. Now we have everything configured. Now we can really use it and generate some pretty cool code and take a look at it. So see you in the next video. Welcome to this video. In the last video, we have set up ng-openAPI gen configuration right here. Now it's time to really execute that command to generate our client-side API code. So let's go ahead and do that. On the right side, go to client app folder, right click and then open in terminal. Now we're inside of that client app folder and we can run npm commands again. So now call npx ng-openAPI-gen. Hit run. You may have noticed that we used npx and not npm, and npx is also a CLI tool, just like npm, whose purpose it is to make it easy to install and manage dependencies hosted in the npm registry. So with npm, you can install packages, and with npx, X stands for execution, you can execute packages, so run them. Now take a look and tell me what you can see here. Error on API generation from HTTPS localhost, right? So he has an error, he cannot download the file. So why is that happening? That's very easy to explain. He cannot create a connection to download that file because our server is not running. So let's start our server again. It's running in the background right now. Click on the right side in the Solution Explorer, right click and then open in terminal again to bring up the PowerShell here. Simply press the arrow key up and then npx ng-openapi-gen again. And now let's see what's happening. As you can see, some files are getting created here, right? So he created API module, base service, and some other stuff. So now you can see that the generation was finished with 2 models and 1 service. Now let's shut down the server. Let's go ahead and inspect what we have now created. In client app folder, open source, app, and then you can see a new folder here, which is called API. Now inside that new API folder, we now have a lot of structure, which is basically code for connecting from Angular to our REST API, then getting data back and directly creating real objects from it. So JSON parsing, right? Because our REST API is responding with JSON information and it will automatically get parsed or converted from JSON into TypeScript thanks to that client app that we have just created with a single command call. Now open up the models folder, for example, and take a look at flight RM and time place RM, right? I guess you can see what's happening here. So he just took a look at our C# class. So he just took a look at the JSON information he received and then built upon that information this interface. Now in our Angular project, we already have a flight read model and a time place read model, right? So now, as I earlier said when we created that interfaces, we will later remove them and let our client-side package handle this. So we will now remove some information and implement that client API here instead. Yeah, if you want to have more information, for example, check the API configuration file. You can see that here, API configuration, there's a root URL, which is pointing to our local host, which is our PC, and then the port for the ASP.NET Core application on the secure port, right? So HTTPS 7208, which is our ASP.NET backend API. So our front end is now referencing the backend of our backend API. So let me just give you one sentence on what happened here. In Angular, in our project right here, we now have a service which we can use to inject it. So this is very similar to ASP.NET Core dependency injection, right? So the package that we have used to generate that client API is providing us a service that we can now use inside of our Angular project anywhere we'd like to start using our API. We will get through all of this, but I'm just talking about that service. On the right side, you can see it here, service.ts. This is exactly what I'm talking about, that flight service here. We can use it and it will automatically point to our flight service RESTful endpoints. Now that said, let's start implementing our automatically generated client API in Angular. Alright, welcome to this video. Let's clean up our project, remove some old stuff and use our generated client API instead. So let me just close some information here so that we start up from a nice and clean view. Then go ahead into search flights component, which we have created, and open up the TS file. So search flights.component.ts. And now let's first of all import some more information here. So import flight service, right? This is the service that got created by using our plugin. And as I said earlier, we can inject that flight service, or we can use it now here. Let's go ahead. API/services/flight.service. There we go. So you can find that located in the API folder, as we have discovered it in the last video. Now, this is the first thing. So the flight service, which is actually the way how we can now connect or get data from our backend API, and then import. We also need that data structure for sure. So it's our flight read model, and we import that from the same folder, API/models. There we go. Now this is already set up. Let me just add a semicolon right here and here too in that line. You can see that underlined, right? So we have a conflict, and this is exactly what we need, because now we know what we can remove. So let's scroll down. Here you can see the interfaces that we have created on our own in one of the first videos. So let's go ahead and remove them now. Because if we change the flight read model in the backend in ASP, we would now go ahead and have to adjust it here manually, right? And this is a problem, as we have discovered already. So instead of doing that manually, we use our tool to create the client-side API, which is exactly this, or it's part of it, right? So let's remove them here, because it would be a duplicate, so we don't need it. Great. Now, as I said, services are injectable. What does that mean? Injectables are like exactly in ASP.NET Core. You can use dependency injection to get a service into your class. So what we do here is we will create a constructor, and inside of that constructor, we will take the flight service. First of all, let's clear that search result, because as I already said, we will now get the data from the backend, not hard-coded in the Angular front end, right? So let's simply clear this completely up, make it an empty array. Here we have our constructor. Inside of that constructor, we now take flight service of type flight service. All right, and now we can use that flight service inside of that class. So let's create a method, which we can then attach to a search button that we have just created, right? We can keep that lifecycle hook ng on init right here, but don't create the new method inside here. So we are outside of that ng on init method. The method is called search, and we'll simply call this flight service, right? It's the one that we have just here received in the constructor from the dependency injection .flight get. We will take a look at that just in a second. And now these calls are all kind of asynchronous. So what we do here is to wait for the result and then finally subscribe something to it. Or to say it in another way, we send a request and directly subscribe something, which gets executed once we have the result, right? So this is a simple asynchronous pattern. You send something, you register a listener, and once you have the response received asynchronous, the subscribed listener will get executed. So in this case, this search result equals to R. Now, what is that expression doing here? So R is the response that we receive. We can also call it response, right? R is just, well, a little bit shorter, but we can call it response. And we take that response and assign it to the search result. So this search result, which is our empty array right here, will be the response which we will receive asynchronously or by the listener we are subscribing here. Awesome. Now, as soon as we will call that method, we will use our flight service client API, which will then call flight get, and this flight get method will talk to our backend API ASP.NET Core and get some information. Afterwards, we have that response, which will then get assigned to the search results, which is data bound by us. We already did that, so we will directly see the information. However, now let's take a look at the flight get here. As I said, flight service got created when we executed our package, our ng OpenAPI generate package. Now let's take a look at flight gen. Right click on it and go to implementation. Here you can see we can set additional parameters, but we have none, right? Remember, in our controller, in ASP.NET Core, on the get method that we have inside of our flight controller, there is no parameter. So this is why we don't, set here any of them. This is why the braces are empty. Now the flight get is type of observable, right? And this is where asynchronous comes in. Observables are like you start them and you can subscribe a listener to it, which get executed once you have the response. So this is what an observable is doing, right? So it's not synchronous, it's asynchronous once you subscribe to it. Now take a look here, return this flight response. We pipe or map it to an array of flight read model, right? So we don't really want to focus too much on it since it's automatically maintained anyway. We really want to focus on how to use the service, not how the service is implemented, right? We really want to focus on how to use the service and not get into much detail on how it's implemented. So there are many ways to do it, right? This is just a very short way using some piping and mapping. However, in the end, the response will be type of array flight read model. And this is the only thing that's important for us to know. Now take a look at the naming convention. Why is this method called flight get? Pretty easy. In ASP.NET Core, our controller was named flight and the method in that controller was type of get. So this is flight controller get method, right? So this is just why it's getting named like this. Great. Now let's switch back. I just wanted to show you the service here and where this flight get is located and that it's type of observable and what it's doing in the end. Now here we have that search method and now we need to attach the button to it, right? So go into the template, and when I say template, I for sure mean the HTML from that component, so search flight component.html. And here we have that search button. Let's go ahead, we can also search for it. Search. Here's that button, you can find it in line 55 for me. Type submit. And now we go ahead and use an event. You already know that. We use the button click event and attach or assign a method to it, which is the search. There you go, search method that we have just created, right? So this is the search flight component HTML. So he will take a look at the search flight component.ts for a search method. So this one will get called. Now let's start our application. Simply hit Ctrl F5. And one thing to mention is every time we now change our backend, our ASP backend, we for sure have to generate the client code again. So we simply go ahead and call the npx just like we did before to update the client code. You can see some compiles error. And you can see that he has a problem with flight departure place. So what you can see here is not the ASP.NET Core backend compilation. This is the compiler of Angular, right? So you will probably see that sometimes when you develop with Angular, because if you have any mistypes, like it happens during every software development, right, you can find some information here. So let's take a look. He's complaining about object is possibly undefined flight departure place. So let's go ahead and take a look. You can see that this is happening in search flights component HTML. So let me explain you why this error is common. If you go to flight read model here, this is what got created from the package that we have used to generate the client API. And you can see this nullable here, right? So airline, arrival, departure, ID, price, they are all nullable. Well, for ID, price and airline, which are of type primitive, it's easy to define a default value, right? The price, the default value for price would be 0 and the default value for string could potentially be empty. So something like this. For our custom interfaces, time place read model, for arrival and departure, we don't have that default values defined. So the problem is that he doesn't know how to handle right now how to handle a nullable. So what we need to do is we need to go to our flight component, and inside here, let's scroll to the flight departure right now. This is the first place. It's happening for departure and arrival. We set departure simply to nullable. So this is what we need to do, because once everything here is compiled, in the end it will all be JavaScript, right? So this TypeScript in the end will become JavaScript, and we need to say how to handle this possible null object. Let's go ahead and assign this question mark to every departure. Make sure to add it not to time, but to possibly nullable departure, and also here in arrival. So everywhere where we use that, we need to add that question mark. Great. Now let's hit run and start the application again. Great. You can now see the compilation was successful. And once we now click on start, we will make a real call into our ASP.NET Core backend onto the search flight controller into the get method to get the data. You can see that here. Did you notice the little delay? Let me just reload the page. Just take a look at that very short delay. Once I click, it takes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 milliseconds, sort of that. This is because it's an observable, right? So we send a request to our ASP.NET Core backend. It gets proceeded and it gets returned all within a couple of milliseconds or whatever. It's just that you know it's an observable, so it's asynchronous. You can see all the information that we have right here is the information which is coming from our ASP.NET Core backend. And this is really very important that you understand how this is working. You have Angular and front end, which has no data at all, right? It has an API which communicates with our RESTful web API in ASP.NET Core, which then sends data back to the client API of Angular, and Angular renders the information then throughout data binding. Never forget that API simply means application programming interface. So there is a difference between our Angular API and our RESTful API in ASP.NET Core. Our ASP.NET Core API is a web API, right? And our Angular API is simply talking to that web API to receive some data. So as I said, never forget, API simply means application programming interface, and it is a way how applications can connect to each other. Now let's continue with the next video. I want to show you how you can handle errors which could probably occur when you make some requests in Angular. In this video, I want to show you how you can handle errors during your requests. So let's simply switch back to our search flight component.ts. Here we got the search method, which will get called when we click on the search button. And here we have that subscribing, right? You can see if we have a response, we can set the search result to that response. Now, if it fails, we can simply go ahead and add a function or method to handle that error. So add a comma, go ahead, this dot handle error. And this is a method we are now about to create. So let me just get that in the correct format here. This looks nice. And now we can create that handle error method. So private handle error. We can for sure also first create that method. Type any. You can simply go ahead and console.log that error if you like. Now there are two things we can do with that error later on. First thing is we can take that error and show it very nicely to the user using a Bootstrap alert box, for example. Or for us as developers, we could take that error and push it into an error queue on a web server, for example, to really get all the error information we need. Now let's save it. This is how you handle it. So once you receive an error during one of your requests, you will now see a console log entry which includes that error. And console.log here is the console in the web browser. So you so in Chrome, you can open it up using Ctrl-Shift-J. Okay, so there is one more thing we should talk about. You can see that flight service flight get method right here. Now, as I said, the naming convention comes from the Swagger JSON file. Let's go ahead into our ASP.NET Core project on the right side. And here we want to go inside of our controller. So open the controllers folder and go into the flight controller. Now, here you can see that the name is search, but it's using an HTTP GET. So the name is coming from flight and then the method get, flight get, right? So this is exactly what we can see here, flight get. Now we want to adjust it maybe to be more specific and, well, a little bit easier to read. A better name would be flight search or search flight, right? So now I want to show you how you can configure Swagger here in ASP.NET Core to create your own custom operation IDs. It's easier than you think. So let's go ahead, open up program.cs, and here in add Swagger gen, use the config again and simply write down c.custom operation IDs. And now we can define a way on how they get constructed. So goes to, then we want to format it. There are multiple ways on how you can format strings in C# for sure. Let's set them together of action descriptor, route values, action as a string. So this is the name of the action. Search would be the action name, right? Because this is a method in C#, but when it comes to API, we also call that action. So the action name here is search. And afterwards, we want to attach the controller name. So we simply go ahead combine both together, just like this. E-action descriptor route values action, E-action descriptor route value controller. Great, now add a semicolon and finish it up. So to fix the error right here, we simply need to remove that line break and then it's working again. So now we have action and controller both combined together. And now let's switch to our search flight component.ts and start the application. And in the developer PowerShell, you can go ahead and use the up arrow ng open API gen. So simply run that to recreate or update our client API in Angular. And it said it's finished. So let's shut down the application. And now we need to adjust it because flight get is not available anymore. We have search flight now, right? So search flight, and this is all we have to do. So our client API is now updated again. Great, and that's it for today. So I hope you learned a lot of new stuff, and I am happy to see you again tomorrow in the next videos.